country. As I just alluded, the major part of our state's success is our thriving energy industry. Something that won't come as a surprise to most people is the fact that Texas leads the country in both oil and natural gas production. But what may surprise you is the fact we're the #1 producer of electricity from wind energy. 1/4 of all U.S. wind energy comes from Texas. There's no doubt that Texas's position as the largest energy-producing state has secured our position as an economic powerhouse. But if the authors of the Green New Deal get their way, oil and gas or all hydrocarbons will be off limits, and the results will be disastrous without anywhere else to turn for an alternative because renewables simply aren't prepared to fill that gap. Hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs, exports would decline, and without a reliable alternative power source, you can expect to spend most of your day in the dark. Instead of talking about plans that would hurt my constituents in Texas and bankrupt the entire country, let's have a serious conversation about real solutions. A few weeks ago, our friend and colleague from Maine, Senator Collins, joined me on a tour of the Net Power demonstration plant in LaPorte, Texas. Net Power has developed a first-of-its-kind system that generates affordable energy from natural gas while producing zero emissions. This kind of innovative carbon capture technology is what our future should look like. If American companies don't produce them first, well, we know somebody else will. So we need to invest in America in new technologies that can take our most reliable and affordable energy sources and make them cleaner. When Senator McConnell announced his intent to bring this bill to the floor, well, things got a little strange around the Senate. In my experience, if the majority leader says he'll bring something you authored to the floor, you're thrilled. Well, not with the Green New Deal. The junior senator from Massachusetts who introduced the resolution in the first place referred to this announcement as sabotage. Well, clearly something is wrong. I believe it's important for us to have a discussion about smart ways to reduce emissions and lessen our environmental footprint. But the way to do that is not through heavy-handed regulations or unrealistic goals to eliminate the fuel sources that we need. Nor is it about throwing in socialist government power grabs that only appeal to a radical wing of the other party, which is basically a distraction from the real issues we should be discussing. So, Mr. President, the Green New Deal is bad for America, it's bad for Texas, and I urge my Democratic colleagues to stop this ideological race to the left and start working with us on practical solutions that actually have a chance to become law. I will vote no on the Green New Deal resolution, and I encourage all of my colleagues to do the same. And finally, Mr. President, this last Saturday marked 1 year since the Fix NICS Act was signed into law. This legislation meant a lot to me personally because it fulfilled a promise that I made to the members of the Sutherland Springs community after the deadliest shooting in Texas history. On November 5, 2017, a deranged gunman opened fire at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, killing 26 people and rocking our entire state to its core. The gunman had a criminal record and a record of violence and mental illness. He had been convicted of domestic violence while serving in the military and by law should not have been able to purchase or even possess a firearm. But the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, known as NICS, did not have a record of his crimes because they had not been transmitted by the United States Air Force to the FBI. In the wake of that tragedy, it's hard to rid your mind of the what-ifs. What if his criminal record had been uploaded to the NICS database? What if he had not been able to purchase a gun? For the friends and family of those lost that day, those questions are almost too tough to ask because they know the answer. Their loved ones might still be alive today. Sadly, there's nothing we can do to bring back the loved ones they lost that day, but I knew there was something we could do to prevent other families and communities from experiencing that sort of pain, grief, and loss. Less than 2 weeks after the tragedy, Senator Murphy from Connecticut and I introduced the Fix NICS Act to prevent these systemic failures from happening again. This legislation penalizes federal agencies who fail to properly report relevant crimes, and it incentivizes states to improve their reporting. This sort of common sense reform gained broad bipartisan support. In fact, there were 77 co-sponsors here in the Senate alone, including both the majority and the minority leaders, something of a rarity in my experience. It also gained the support of a diverse group of national organizations, from the National Rifle Association to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the National Shooting Sports Foundation. When President Trump signed this bill 1 year ago, it marked the strongest update to the background check system in a decade. I appreciate the support of my colleagues for this legislation. What we were able to demonstrate is that Congress can work in a bipartisan way to address a problem if we just put our minds to it. And I appreciate the support of the Sutherland Springs community in the wake of the tragedy, something that they are still feeling even today. I'm confident that this legislation will help save lives and make our communities safer. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I believe climate change is real. I believe that human emissions are a major cause of climate change. And I believe the Democratic plan for climate change, which the senator from Texas just spoke about, the Green New Deal, is so far out in left field that not many are going to take it seriously. So as one Republican, I'm here today to propose this response to climate change. And that is that the United States should launch a new Manhattan Project for clean energy, a 5-year project with 10 grand challenges that will use American research and technology to put our country and our world firmly on the path toward cleaner, cheaper energy. Meeting these grand challenges would create breakthroughs in advanced nuclear reactors, in natural gas, in carbon recapture, better batteries, greener buildings, electric vehicles, cheaper solar power, and fusion. To provide the tools to create these breakthroughs, the federal government should double its funding for energy research and keep the United States #1 in advanced computing. Mr. President, this strategy takes advantage of the United States secret weapon, our extraordinary capacity for basic research, especially in our 17 national laboratories. It will strengthen our economy. It will raise family incomes. This strategy also recognizes that when it comes to climate change, China, India, and other developing countries are the problem. American innovation is the answer. According to the Global Carbon Project, over the last 13 years, the United States has reduced production of greenhouse gases more than any other major country. Let me say that again. According to the Global Carbon Project, over the last 13 years, the United States has reduced production of greenhouse gases more than any other major country. But over the last 5 years, China and its carbon emissions have risen. The U.S. reduction is largely thanks to conservation and to switching from coal to natural gas in the production of electricity. This is the way a California physicist explains it. Our mothers told us as children to clean our plates because children in India were starving. Now, cleaning our plates was a good thing for us to do, but didn't do much for starving children in India. In the same way, reducing carbon emissions in the United States is a good thing to do. But it doesn't do much to address climate change because most of the increase in greenhouse gases is in developing countries. If we want to do something about climate change, we should use American research and technology to provide the rest of the world with tools to create low-cost energy that emits fewer greenhouse gases. The purpose of the original Manhattan Project during World War II was to find a way to split the atom and build a bomb before Germany could. The New York Times described this as, quote, the most concentrated intellectual effort in history, unquote. Instead of ending a war, the goal of the new Manhattan Project will be to minimize the disruption on our lives and our economies caused by climate change, to clean the air, and to raise family incomes, both in our country and in the rest of the world, by creating large amounts of reliable, clean, inexpensive energy. Can a new Manhattan Project accomplish such bold breakthroughs in just 5 years? Well, take a look at the last 5 years. Carbon emissions from energy consumption are down by 230 million metric tons. The number of electric vehicles has doubled, and so has the median driving range per charge. The utility scale cost of solar power has been nearly cut in half. The number of homes has risen by 4%, but household energy usage has decreased by 10%. We lost and then we reclaimed the #1 spot in supercomputing. The cost of natural gas has been cut in half. The percent of electricity provided by natural gas has increased from 27% to 35%, and that's all in the last 5 years. I will not spend time in these remarks debunking the Green New Deal, because so many others have so effectively already done that. Basically, the Green New Deal is an assault on cars, cows, and combustion. With nuclear power available, its strategy for fighting climate change with windmills makes as much sense as going to war in sailboats. As a bonus, it throws in, as the senator from Texas outlined, it throws in free college, a guaranteed job with a government-set wage, and it would take away private health insurance, the insurance they have on the job, from 170 million Americans, and no one has any earthly idea what it will cost taxpayers. You don't have to believe humans cause climate change to believe in the new Manhattan Clean Energy Project. And you don't have to be a Republican. Hopefully, the new Manhattan Project for Clean Energy can become a bipartisan proposal. Many of its 10 grand challenges have been proposed by the National Institute of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences. At different times, Barack Obama and John McCain and Newt Gingrich and Howard Dean all have called for a Manhattan Project for new energy sources. These are the 10 grand challenges. First, advanced nuclear. 98 nuclear reactors produce 60% of all carbon-free electricity in the United States. There's never been a death as a result of an accident at one of these reactors. The problem is, in competition with natural gas and coal, these reactors cost too much to build, and some of them cost too much to operate. According to the Energy Information Administration, 11 reactors may shut down over the next 5 years. Building the Vogtle nuclear plant in Georgia, the only 2 new reactors being built today in the United States, could cost as much as $27.5 billion. Building 2 natural gas plants to create the same amount of electricity would cost less than $2 billion. We need to stop talking about advanced reactors and start building something. Within the next 5 years, we need to build 1 or more advanced reactors to demonstrate the capabilities they may bring: lower costs, increased safety, and less nuclear waste. Natural gas. During the 1980s, American enterprise and technology created a new, cheaper way to produce natural gas in the United States. This helped our country lead the world in reducing carbon emissions, because natural gas has about half the carbon emissions as a typical coal plant. Continuing to develop new combustion technologies will make a natural gas-fired electric generation more efficient and further reduce carbon emissions. Next, carbon capture. This is really the holy grail of clean energy. Coal is cheap. There's a lot of it. Already we know how to capture sulfur, nitrogen, and mercury from coal plants to clean the air. We've seen that happen in Tennessee. If we can figure out a way also to capture carbon at a cheaper cost and find large-scale uses for its byproduct, for example, CO2 to ethanol, coal could be used everywhere in the world. The Natural Resources Defense Council has argued that after conservation, coal with carbon capture is the best option for clean energy. Next, better batteries. The all-electric Nissan Leaf that I bought in 2011 had a hard time getting me from the Capitol to Dulles Airport and back. Its range was about 70 miles. Today, the Nissan Leaf can travel 226 miles on one charge, and a Tesla Model S can travel 335 miles on one charge. The price of lithium-ion batteries should fall another 45% during the next 5 years. Batteries can also one day allow utilities and their customers to store large amounts of electricity during non-peak hours. And then greener buildings. Despite considerable recent progress, this is still the real low-hanging fruit. Residential and commercial buildings still consume 39% of U.S. energy. The next grand challenge is electric vehicles. 10 years ago, there were no mass-produced electric cars on United States highways. Today, there are 1 million, and you read in the paper almost every day about a major automaker making a large investment to make millions more. Cheaper solar. Solar power has grown by 1,500% since 2011, but still accounts for only about 2% of U.S. electricity. The new goal for the Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative is to lower the cost of solar another 50% to 0.03 per kilowatt hour for utility scale solar. Then fusion. This is the ultimate green energy dream. Make electricity on Earth the way the sun makes it. Instead of splitting elements, combine them and make clean, almost limitless energy without waste. This is still a dream, but there can be meaningful progress in the next 5 years. Advanced computing. China, Japan, the United States, and the European Union all want to be first in advanced computing. The stakes are high because the winner has an advantage in such things as advanced manufacturing, stimulating advanced reactors and weapons before they are built, finding terrorists, saving billions of Medicaid waste, and simulating the electric grid in a natural disaster. The U.S. regained the #1 spot last year in advanced computing thanks to sustained funding by Congress during both the Obama and Trump administrations, and we need to keep that position. And the final grand challenge is to double energy research funding. Advanced computing is the first tool the new Manhattan Project needs to meet its grand challenges. The second tool is money. It would take $6 billion annually to double funding for the Department of Energy's Office of Science and its 17 national laboratories, which are where most of our nation's basic energy research is done. By comparison, many estimate the cost of the Green New Deal in trillions annually. Mr. President, this is a bold agenda, and hopefully a bipartisan agenda. It is an agenda that can, over the next 5 years, place Americans firmly on the path toward dealing with climate change and at the same time produce large amounts of reliable, clean energy that lifts family incomes in our country and around the world. Mr. President, I would ask consent to include in the record, following my remarks, an op-ed in the New York Times from the year 2012, authored by Rich Mueller, a professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley, entitled "The Conversion of a Climate Change Skeptic." And second, an address I made in Oak Ridge, Tennessee in 2008, calling for a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence.
Without objection.
I thank the President I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Today, Attorney General Barr transmitted to Congress his summary of the special counsel's principal conclusions from his investigation into Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 election. The result of that investigation is being hailed as good news for the president, and it certainly is that. But really, it's good news for our entire country. It's good news that our law enforcement professionals know much more about Russia's malevolent attempts to interfere in American elections. And it's good news that we can conclusively set aside the notion that the president and his team had somehow participated in those attacks on our democracy. According to the Attorney General, the special counsel's in-depth investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its effort to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. That really says it all. Further, Attorney General Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein concluded the investigation did not establish that the president engaged in obstruction of justice. So, 2 years, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of search warrants, hundreds of witnesses, millions of taxpayer dollars, and these are the findings, Madam President. No collusion, no conspiracy, no obstruction. What the investigation did produce, it seems, is a deep examination of Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 election. The Attorney General reports that Russia carried out online disinformation campaigns and computer hacking efforts designed to sow discord in our nation and interfere in American politics. It is deeply disturbing that the Obama administration was apparently insufficiently prepared to anticipate and counter these Russian threats. It was hardly a secret prior to November 2016 that Putin's Russia was not and is not our friend. And yet, for years, the previous administration ignored, excused, and failed to confront Putin's malign activities, both at home and abroad. I'm glad the special counsel's report will contribute new insight and new understanding to our awareness of Russian activities. I look forward to the release of more information in the coming days, as the Attorney General has said he intends to do in consultation with Special Counsel Mueller. And I look forward as well to the continuing parallel work of our Senate colleagues on the Select Committee on Intelligence to study the threats that foreign interference pose to our institutions. So like I said, in any sane political moment, all of this would be very welcome news to all Americans in a normal time. But we know that, amazingly, the reaction in some corners of the far left has seemed not to be celebration, but rather disappointment. Huge components of the Democratic Party and their media allies have spent literally years spinning intricate theories about this presidency and trying to sell the American people on their wild claims. It's as if many of our Democratic colleagues are still just unable to process the simple fact, yes, the American people elected this Republican president over his Democratic opponent. We're faced with new evidence every day that our Republican policies are delivering exactly the change that middle-class families voted for back in 2016. Yet even still, many on the left remain convinced that only conspiracy and corruption could possibly explain why they might actually lose an election. Well, in the real world, the American people hired this president to clean up the mess of the preceding 8 years. That's exactly what we've set about doing. And the results are clear. The nation is clearly better off than it was 2 years ago. So I sincerely hope that now at last our friends on the left will be able to put aside their fixation on permanently relitigating their loss in 2016 and actually join in the productive work that the rest of us have been proudly engaged in for the past 2 years and counting. Well, unfortunately, Madam President, the events of the last few months have not exactly indicated that productive, practical cooperation is what our Democratic colleagues have in mind. To the contrary, the nation has watched the Democratic Party has engaged in a collective headlong sprint toward the left, as far to the left as possible, as fast as possible. They proposed a massive rewriting of the rules of American politics. They proposed scrapping Medicare, slapping its name on a brand new one-size-fits-all government insurance plan, and then making American families' existing private insurance policies illegal. And of course, they proposed what the Senate will be voting on later this week, the famous Green New Deal. My colleagues and I will have plenty more to say on this subject in the coming days. So today, I just want to say that I could not be more glad that the American people will have the opportunity to learn precisely where each one of their senators stand on this radical, top-down, socialist makeover of the entire U.S. economy. Middle-class families will get to see if their senators have been wooed by the disjointed contents of leftish daydreams. Hardworking Americans in Kentucky and around the country employed in the energy and manufacturing industries will get to see if their senators support eliminating all fossil fuels and suffocating their livelihoods. Homeowners who take pride in their hard-earned investment will get to see if their senators are in favor of forcible DC remodeling of every building in America. Working-class Americans who are benefiting from our growing economy and historic job market will learn if their senators support turning away from free enterprise and implementing a new government-driven employment system. Families who have to budget for household expenses will see which senators vote to increase their electricity bills by what one analysis pegs as, listen to this, $300 a month. And of course, every American taxpayer will get to learn if their senators support saddling our nation with the astronomical cost of this socialist fantasy, tens and tens of trillions of dollars, a tax burden that would be certain to hurt not just wealthy Americans, but the middle class as well. On all of these questions, on this whole Democratic effort to rebrand all the failed ideas of the 20th century socialism with a little green paint, every member of this body will have the opportunity to cast a clear vote this very week. American people, Madam President, deserve to know which senators can reject this crippling proposal right away, and which senators find themselves unable to do that. And that's exactly what they'll learn later this week. But first, later today, the Senate will vote to advance the nomination of yet another of President Trump's qualified choices for the federal bench. Richard Beatty of Arizona has been tapped to serve on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She brings with her well-rounded experience as a legal professional. She's a two-time graduate of Arizona State University and has served with distinction at the Department of Justice, the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, as a special counsel in private practice, and most recently as a magistrate judge. Our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee saw fit to forward Ms. Bates' nomination with bipartisan support, and I hope all senators will join me in voting to advance it later today.
Madam President,
Democratic leader.
first, all of us heard the sad news today. Nice for him, sad for us, that Tom Udall will not seek re-election. He is one of the most principled, hardest-working senators we have. He's bright, he's dedicated, and he has such integrity, which runs in the Udall family. When he gets up to speak, every senator, Democrat and Republican, always knows how well thought out his remarks will be and how sincere they are. He's not doing this for some angle or political purpose. He's just the kind of person the Founding Fathers wanted to serve in the United States Senate. His leadership on reforming the campaign finance system, on protecting the environment, on advocating on behalf of Native American communities, shepherding legislation to protect America from harmful chemicals, and so much more has been invaluable. We'll all be saying more about Tom in the next little while, but we will miss him. He's been a wonderful senator, a great friend, and a wonderful member of this caucus. Now, Madam President, I'm going to speak briefly on the matter of climate change, and then I'll address the matters relating to the special counsel's investigation. During the last month, this chamber has been the forum for debate of a topic I never thought I'd see Republicans raise on their own: climate change. They've long been the party of climate change denial, with President Trump as the climate change denier-in-chief. It's an awfully difficult position to defend. It becomes more difficult every week and every month, and it's directly at odds with strong consensus views of scientists in the United States around the globe. As our weather changes, as we face more disasters, the average American more and more is saying, uh-oh, climate change. I wonder what the people in Nebraska and Iowa think, that they've gotten these huge floods, so devastating to them. So it's long past time for Republicans to take the issue seriously. This chamber is supposed to debate the most serious issues of our day. Climate change is at the very top of the list and shouldn't be an exception. That's why for a month, all 47 Democrats have asked our Republican colleagues 3 simple questions which none of them will answer. They're going to have to answer it sooner or later. 1, do you agree that climate change is real? 2, do you agree it's caused by human action? And 3, do you believe that Congress should take immediate action to combat its effects? We're not prescribing one part or another. We're saying, let's debate it. Let's not do a sham vote that's meant to embarrass one person or another. This is too serious an issue for that. Republicans owe the American people some real answers, not games. Because just over the last week, as I mentioned, in the plains of Iowa, we saw the devastating effects of climate change with devastating clarity. The kind of weather we saw in the Iowa plains has no precedent. It was the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane lambasting the heart of the Middle West. Our hearts are with the people whose homes were destroyed or damaged, whose farms are decimated, the animals that were lost. The science is clear. A changing climate and warmer air make these freakish weather incidents more likely, more intense. Now, Republicans may want to keep their heads in the sand. I think that's a loser for them, especially among younger voters, younger voters, younger voters. Like in so many other issues, our Republicans are clinging to the past, not looking at what's happened. But Republicans do so at their own peril. With each passing year, their climate change denial is increasingly out of step with American people. A majority of Americans, 2/3, including a large percentage of Republicans, believe climate change is real, believe human action has accelerated its pace, and they know it for a very simple reason. They can see it themselves. On the South Shore of Long Island, very Republican areas, all of a sudden, after Sandy, understood the need to address climate change. And that's happening all over the country. Every time a fire devastates California, another hurricane strikes the Gulf states, biblical flooding strikes some part of the country or other, the American people see the effects of climate change. They see them personally, not theoretically. That's what's happening. Indeed, scientists in the U.S. and Canada now say that evidence for climate change has reached a, quote, gold standard of certainty. And so what have Republicans done about it? Rather than take these warnings seriously, they choose to play games with our planet's future. Rather than get serious about the world our children will inherit, Leader McConnell is elected to push a sham vote on their version of the Green New Deal. And they'll play that game right before voting on funding for natural disaster relief. Let there be no doubt, these disasters are magnified precisely because of climate change. I cannot fathom the level of cognitive dissonance required to schedule these two votes right after one another. But, Mr. President, no one's fooled by the Republican attempts to posture and politicize climate change. If they really want to debate the issue, let's debate it. Let's bring different views to the floor. Let's see how people vote. Let's not put something on the floor for the first time, a serious proposal on climate change, which the leader has never put on the floor. Let's debate them all. We're not getting that to happen. Oh, no. Just a game. Politics, 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 which the American people on this issue and so many others dislike. So, let Republicans come at us with all they've got. The facts are on the people who understand that climate change is real. It's no wonder our Republican colleagues don't want a real debate but a game. But the American people are not going to be fooled by the Republican stunt vote. Democrats were prepared to take bold action to address the climate change crisis head-on. That's why we're pushing for a creation of a bipartisan committee on climate change so we can examine this issue with the level of urgency and depth it deserves. I urge my colleagues on the other side who know the truth to speak out and join us as we try and put a halt to the greatest threat of our time. Now on another matter. Last night, Attorney General Barr delivered a brief letter to Congress that included his summary of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. We have all seen the Attorney General's letter, but none of us, neither the Congress nor the public, has seen the report itself. The Justice Department has declined even to say how many pages the report includes, as if that were some sort of state secret. After all, let's not forget why we're here in the first place. 2 years ago, a hostile power attacked our democracy. As Mr. Barr's letter said, Russian actors, with the backing of Mr. Putin, waged a sophisticated and malicious campaign of disinformation and falsehood in order to influence the outcome of our elections. That's never happened before. The American people deserve to see the documentation. What did they do? Who did they approach? What happened? Sweep an issue like this under the rug when the security of our wellspring elections, fair, uninterfered with by foreign power elections, is at stake? So it's evident, it's self-evident, overwhelmingly, in the public interest for the Mueller report to be released to the people. The American people simply want the truth. Each American, if he chooses or she chooses, can read the report for themselves and draw their own conclusions. Whether or not you're a supporter of President Trump or not, whatever you feel, there is no good reason not to make the report public. On March 14th, just prior to the recess, the House of Representatives surprised a lot of our Republican friends here in the Senate. They passed a resolution calling for the report to be made public. Guess what the vote was? 420 to nothing. Even the most vociferous defenders of President Trump, Mr. Meadows, Mr. Jordan, voted yes. When the resolution arrived here in the Senate, I asked unanimous consent and that it would be adopted. I thought it would be. Regrettably, one senator objected. The senator from South Carolina, my friend Senator Graham, said he wouldn't agree to the resolution unless it was amended to call for a special prosecutor to investigate Hillary Clinton. And so the Senate was unable to pass a resolution that passed the House unanimously without controversy. In fact, President Trump has said even before the report came out and repeatedly afterwards, several times, he supported passage of the House resolution. He supports making it public. So have a good number of my Republican colleagues, a whole bunch today. So in a moment, I'm going to renew my request of March 14th that the Senate adopt House concurrent resolution calling for public release of the Mueller report. Now that President Trump supports public release of the report, there's no good reason for anyone to object to this request. It's a simple request for transparency, nothing more, nothing less, not to make a decision as to what you believe, not to say what we ought to do about it, just to make it public. Transparency, a great American virtue that we've tried to uphold through the centuries. So, I hope I will not hear a request from the other side to amend the resolution to call for a different special counsel investigation. If there's going to be objection, the American people deserve to know why. Why should this report not be made public? Not why something else shouldn't be done, not some extraneous issue. Why shouldn't this report be made public? And I'd ask my friend the leader, because I see him rising, I imagine he's going to object, to give a reason why this report should not be made public, not that something else should be done at the same time. This is serious stuff. If there's an objection raised, it will only serve to frustrate the compelling public interest that's made in the special counsel's report and making it public. Therefore, Mr. President, I'll now give the Senate another opportunity to join every one of their colleagues in calling for the public release of this important report. And so, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H-Con Res 24, expressing the sense of the Congress that the report of Special Counsel Mueller should be made available to the public and to Congress, and which is at the desk. Further, that the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. As I said just a few moments ago, it's certainly good news for the country that the special counsel concluded that there is no evidence that the Trump campaign collaborated or conspired with the Russian government to influence the last presidential election. It's also good news for the country that due to the special counsel's work, we now have more insight into Russia's efforts to interfere with our democratic institutions. Now, I've consistently supported the proposition that the special counsel should be allowed to finish his work without interference. The work of the special counsel, however, is not yet complete. Neither is the work of the Department of Justice. The Attorney General told us yesterday that he's working with the special counsel to determine how much of the special counsel's report can be produced without violating the law and without jeopardizing other ongoing matters, including other matters initiated by the special counsel. The special counsel and the Justice Department ought to be allowed to finish their work in a professional manner. Now, my good friend, the Democratic leader, was all for allowing the special counsel to conduct his work without political interference when it might be politically advantageous to him. But apparently, my friend from New York is not for allowing the special counsel to complete his work with the Justice Department according to his best professional and legal judgment, when that might be inconvenient to my friend's own current political purposes. To date, the Attorney General has followed through on his commitments to the Congress. One of those commitments is that he intends to release as much information as possible. I certainly welcome that commitment to transparency, as do others. But to the extent that the Attorney General, in consulting with the special counsel, believes it is important to protect sensitive sources and methods, protect material that could affect ongoing investigations and prosecutions, and is legally protected, then he deserves the time to work through these issues. So I'm going to object in order to allow the special counsel and the Justice Department to finish their careful professional review of a no doubt voluminous record, a record that likely contains sensitive, classified, and legally protected material. For all of those reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, I'll be brief.
Minority Leader's recognized.
The resolution does not say it has to be done immediately. The resolution certainly allows for the Attorney General to make sure that nothing is released that violates the law. All it says is it ought to be released. It is hard to understand why the Majority Leader wouldn't be for that resolution. None of his objections, none, are in the words of the report. In fact, the words of the report are very simple. It should a sense of the Congress that it should be released. Not when, not in violation of the law, not in a hurried matter, just be released. So I'm sort of befuddled by at least the Majority Leader's reasoning in this regard, because it is not in the words of this resolution. Yield the floor.
Majority Leader.
The country and the president have had to wait for 2 years. It's been going on for 2 years. This very extensive investigation took 2 years to be concluded. So look, it's not unreasonable to give the special counsel and the Justice Department just a little time to complete their review in a professional and responsible manner. Remember, as I said earlier, we're likely dealing here with potential other prosecutions, classified information, damaging people's reputations. There's no evidence that the Attorney General is not going to produce as much information as possible for all of us. And that's why I objected. I think it's a reasonable thing to do. We've been waiting for a long time for this report to wrap up. It's largely good news, not just for the president, but for the country.
Mr. President.
Minority Leader.
Again, this language was good enough for every Republican in the Senate, as well as every Democrat. The president himself says it should be released. It's hard to understand why the Majority Leader should stand alone with objections no one else found to be reasonable or sustainable and oppose this resolution. The report should be made public, and the Senate should resolve that it should be. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. President, revolution is deeply embedded in the character of this nation. More than 2 centuries ago, delegates from across the American colonies gathered in Philadelphia to take what was audacious action. They risked everything, including their life, by declaring independence from the greatest and strongest power in the world at that time, the British Empire. I am proud to say that my forefather served in George Washington's army, and he was called to risk his life and serve in the Continental Army to fight for an idea that freedom and liberty would reign in this country. As Americans throughout history, we have been called to service. Sometimes we are called to service by the clear and present danger, such as the bombing at Pearl Harbor. Sometimes we are called to greatness by stretching our imagination, like when we went to the moon. And sometimes we are called to unity by necessity, because the stakes of inaction are simply too high. Today, the United States faces such a challenge, and I believe we can once again prove our greatness. It is an undeniable fact that climate change, caused in large part by humans, is a threat to Michigan, our Great Lakes, our country, and our planet. Climate change poses a threat not only to the lands and waters that we all depend on, but also to our health, our economy, and even our national security. It is also undeniable that the United States, unified in purpose, can meet the challenges and defeat the threats caused by climate change. But we need to take action now. Time is simply not on our side. Without question, taking action involves political risk, but doing nothing is simply not an option. The longer we wait, the risks to our planet only grow more challenging and difficult to solve. Our planet is showing clear, unequivocal evidence of climate change, according to an overwhelming scientific consensus. Our ice caps are melting, our oceans are warming, severe weather is becoming the new normal, and land temperatures are rising. Just last week, an alarming new report found that the Great Lakes are warming more quickly than other parts of the country. This change will negatively impact fish species, lead to more algal blooms, cause flood damage to communities, to homes and businesses, and irreversibly alter a sensitive ecosystem that provides drinking water for 40 million Americans. I represent the Great Lakes state, and climate change threatens our economy and our way of life. Mr. President, I'm disappointed that instead of working together on common sense efforts and treating climate change with the seriousness that it deserves, the Republican Senate Majority Leader has chosen to waste limited floor time on a political stunt. What we should be doing is having a thoughtful debate on the need to address a significant threat to our country. Rather than playing partisan games, it is time to find unity and take bold action. The Senate must come together to pass real concrete policies that will help mitigate climate change and wean us from our dependence on fossil fuels. I know it's possible because I've worked on bipartisan efforts with my colleagues to advance clean energy and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Together, we have advanced technology innovation, fueled our nation's transportation with cleaner energy, bolstered our nation's infrastructure to be more resilient to climate impacts, offered incentives for carbon capture sequestration, and boosted energy efficiency. These are all accomplishments that we have done together, but more needs to be done. This Congress, as we consider a surface transportation reauthorization package as well as a new Water Resource Development Act, it would be foolish to ignore climate impacts as we spend taxpayer dollars for infrastructure. We must seize the opportunity presented by a clean energy economy to continue driving American innovation while creating sustainable, good-paying jobs. Today, our auto industry in Michigan is rapidly working to advance electrification. Just last week, General Motors announced plans to add 400 jobs and invest $300 million to build a new electric car at their Orion plant. But despite these efforts, our state and our country have been hurt by the lack of a coherent, cohesive, and forward-looking policy that grows our economy while protecting our environment. We need a policy that ensures renewable energy is produced here in America and done in a way that creates jobs and strengthens our national security. And I know that we can do it if only we can find the political will. Together, we can effectively confront climate change in a way that benefits Michigan workers and families, our Great Lakes, and the entire country. The science is clear, but time is not on our side. We must take action now to confront climate change before it is too late. I urge my colleagues to stop playing political games. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work on solving the climate change crisis together. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise for a moment to talk about a vote we'll have tomorrow in this chamber on a motion to adopt an amendment to the supplemental appropriation passed by the House. And it's a disaster amendment dealing with the states that have been afflicted by disasters over the last 2 years. Most of them southern states, but not all. Some of them include the territory of Puerto Rico, and I'm going to go over the details in just a second. But first of all, some of you may see floating around, because there are a lot of them around, this memorandum from the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the House and the vice chairman in the Senate. It talks about an agreement that was had at one time on the disaster money and refers to the Puerto Rico being shortchanged and refers to the fact that we need to make sure that doesn't happen. So I want to give you the facts just a second. Georgia, which I represent, is one of a number of states which include Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alaska, California, and Hawaii, have experienced significant disasters in the past 2 years. We saw the fires in California on our TVs. We saw the volcanoes in Hawaii. We saw the blueberries in Georgia fall off the vine and be destroyed. We saw all the things that happened to these crops in these places. We saw Alaska's earthquake and all the damage it did. All those things have received nothing yet. Puerto Rico has already received $40 billion for disaster aid for what happened in Maria, and there's $19 billion of that money remains unspent. So it's not that Puerto Rico hadn't gotten any money. They've gotten a lot of money, $40 billion more, and the amendment that I want to talk about in just a second gives them $600 million more. But there's a lot of places in this country that are states that we all represent have gotten nothing and had big disasters in the past 2 years. And these disasters are hurting our economy, our people, and our states. So I want to, any of you that see this email or this flyer tomorrow, or any of you hear the debate tomorrow, what has happened is this flyer says that Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Leahy, is going to object to the substitute that's going to be offered by Senator Perdue and myself tomorrow to the bill that will be debated, unless Puerto Rico gets a better shake. Point, Puerto Rico's already gotten 41, only spent 19. They got 19 left to spend, 19 billion left to spend. We had 600 million in the amendment we're going to offer tomorrow to see to it they don't run out of SNAP money at the end of this month, which is they will because of the way that everything's stand currently. Puerto Rico's being treated great. Now, there's their CDBG money, which they want. No, it's not in there. But it isn't in there for anybody else either. Fair is an interesting word, by the way. Fair, I think, is when you and I are treated fairly. We both get equal, proportionate shots at money or opportunity or things of that nature. Unfair is when somebody weights the formula against our favor or somebody takes undue advantage of a special situation. Well, this is a special situation. A lot of people are going to go without help by the end of next month. Farm bills are going to come due, and banks are going to foreclose on them. There are going to be a lot of people in agriculture who are going to be hurt badly. People who have been hurt by the fires in California will not be helped. Those who've experienced earthquake damage in Alaska are not going to be helped. A lot of people are not going to be helped. What we need to do is put off this guise of fairness, and let's just be really fair. Let's see to it that we put the additional $600 million, which the amendment does, to see to it that people on SNAP in Puerto Rico get their money. Let's see to it that those people in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina and the other states that have been damaged by hurricanes or floods or volcanoes or fires get their money. There are going to be more emergencies, and we all know that. We've all hated emergencies for a lot of reasons that appropriators most especially have. Nobody wants to have to do that. But when our state, your state or mine, is injured dramatically in a disastrous hurricane or a tornado or whatever, we as a country have always compassionately dealt with the results of those storms, the losses those states have felt, and helped those states get back on their feet, and those people be served. We're not asking for a hand up, we're asking for a hand out, we're asking for a hand up in each of those states, and they've been waiting for a long time. Now, I will tell you as one who knows what I'm talking about in Georgia, and I'm not saying this is true in any other state, although I know it is. We have farmers who've gone through a cycle and their farm financing was done through banks that at the end of this month they're going to have to either act on those loans and call them for payment or have a refinance schedule knowing they've got some money coming down the line. If this passes, it's agreed to by the House, and the banks get the message that we're trying to help them like we always have in the past, they'll have a chance to make those negotiations, pay the money back that they borrow, do it over time in production and give people jobs in the fields rather than go back and tell them we can't give them any money, we can't help them, have them lose the farm and lose the business, and us lose a lot of jobs. It's just not right and it's not fair. And I used the word fair just then because I think fair is the definition of seeing to it Puerto Rico and Georgia and South Carolina and others get help. They have an agreement. So I will tell you, when you get this, read it. It sounds like we agreed to something 3 weeks ago, and all of a sudden we're not agreeing to the same thing. That's not true. We agreed last week when we left to what this would be tomorrow, to what the supplemental would look like, what would be included in it. And as I understood it, in my sense of understanding, we had agreed to all the things. Was there enough money for Puerto Rico as far as Puerto Rico said? No, they wanted more. Would Florida have liked more? Georgia would like more? Yeah, they would have liked more. But in fairness and equity, what you'll vote on tomorrow is fair and equitable to those people. And I would urge you to consider and listen to the debate, listen to what everybody tells you about what has happened, before you make a decision that anybody's getting hurt, because instead what you're going to do, if you fall for this scenario, you're going to really hurt some people who otherwise are going to be helped through deliberations that have taken over part of the last 2 or 3 months. So, Mr. President, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the opportunity to come here. I wish I could talk about something other than the disasters and spending money, but I can't. A lot of you have lost their lives, their farms, and a lot of their future. And I want to see to it, to the extent we can help in an equitable fashion in those states and territories, that we do so. And I yield back my time. I yield back my time.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
President, I rise to speak this afternoon on the upcoming vote on the Majority Leader's Green New Deal resolution, a resolution that ironically he does not apparently support. First, I want to say this about the Green New Deal. Even our Republican friends cannot deny that this resolution has sparked a national conversation and generated a great deal of enthusiasm among the American people, especially among younger Americans. It reminds me of the time, Mr. President, when I was a young naval flight officer stationed at Moffett Field Naval Air Station just south of San Francisco, waiting to be deployed to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. I joined millions of Americans across our country that year and celebrated our nation's very first Earth Day. As I listened to the rising chorus of voices calling for climate action today, Mr. President, I hear the sounds of that day in Golden Gate Park. I remember the urgency we felt then to address the environmental challenges facing our nation and our world, and I feel an even greater sense of urgency today. That's why it's so disappointing to me that our Republican colleagues, not all of them, but a number of them, are trying to make a mockery of the very real concerns and the passionate calls for action that we're hearing from people across this country and indeed around the world. This is not a time for a derision. This is not a time for division. On an issue as serious as this for Mr. President, we ought to be serious about addressing it. However, it's become clear that some, not all, some of our Republican friends would rather just have some fun and talk maybe about hamburgers and cheeseburgers and that kind of thing. Worse, some have conflated meaningful action on climate change with socialism. Mr. President, with the death of our late colleague John McCain, I am the last Vietnam veteran serving in the United States Senate. I served 5 years during the hot war in Southeast Asia to oppose the expansion of communism. Shortly after we celebrated that first ever Earth Day in 1970, I was sent on my first of 3 deployments to Southeast Asia, before eventually serving another 18 years until the end of the Cold War as a Navy P-3 aircraft mission commander in the Naval Reserve and retiring as a naval captain after chasing Soviet submarines in all the oceans of the world. I'm not a socialist. Like most of our colleagues here, I am an American patriot and proud to be one. I care deeply about this planet, and I know we can have cleaner air and water while creating jobs. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Our Republican colleagues know better than that, and they owe our country better than that. In recent weeks, Mr. President, our Republican colleagues have thrown around a $93 trillion number. That wildly overestimated number primarily refers to provisions in the Green New Deal that are not directly related to climate change. And at a time when our country is looking to Congress for leadership on climate action, hiding behind political games, deception, and scare tactics is irresponsible. It's cowardly when we ought to be brave. Right now, a clear majority of Americans want us in Congress to address the growing climate crisis that's facing our country and our planet. We should be having a fact-based, policy-driven conversation about tackling this crisis. And we should be talking about the real costs that confront us, including the cost of inaction. I live in Delaware, lowest lying state in our country. Our state is sinking. The oceans around us are rising. According to our nation's leading scientists, climate change unchecked means more sea level rise, costing coastal communities up and down the East Coast, like my state, trillions of dollars in economic damages over the next 80 years. In the Northeast, we're experiencing rain events where we are measuring rain by the foot, not the inch. Not too far from where we stand here today, in Ellicott City, Maryland, Ellicott City has withstood not one but two 1,000-year floods in less than 2 years. Think about that. They've withstood not one but 2,000-year floods in less than 2 years. Today, our neighbors across the Missouri River Basin, our hearts go out to them, but they're suffering through catastrophic flooding. And as of Friday, the cost of damage to Nebraska alone already surpassed $1.3 billion. And the damage to Iowa alone was estimated at $1.6 billion. Some cities are currently without fresh water. In Missouri, entire communities have been evacuated. In northwestern Missouri, roughly 40,000 acres of farmland was still underwater this past Friday. Our nation's scientists tell us that climate change unchecked means more frequent and more intense storms, meaning bomb cyclones. I didn't even know there was such a thing, bomb cyclones, but there are. Intense rainfalls and Category 5 hurricanes become the new normal. Last year, we witnessed the tragic devastation caused by wildfires, fueled by drought and by heat, like the California wildfires. Imagine what we could face in 2050 when, according to our nation's scientists, wildfire seasons burn up to 6 times more forest area each year. The extreme weather events we see today are already taking a toll on American lives, on American livelihoods, and on our nation's budget. According to NOAA, in 2017 alone, extreme weather cost Americans $300 billion in economic damages, a new record, a new record. That same year, the federal government spent $120 billion in federal disaster spending for just 4 extreme weather events, just 4. Earlier this month, the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office released its biennial high-risk list and once again identified climate change as a significant fiscal risk to the federal government, and I might add, to taxpayers. According to GAO, since 2005, federal funding for disaster assistance has reached $430 billion, nearly $500 billion, and those costs will continue to rise. GAO says, and I quote, "Disaster costs are projected to increase as extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change," close quote. NOAA and NASA tell us these numbers will be a drop in the bucket compared to our new climate future if we do not act on climate change. If we do not change course, Mr. President, just about every major economic sector in the United States will be negatively affected by climate change by the turn of this century. And some sectors could see hundreds of billions of dollars of losses every year. Add it all up, and climate change could slash up to 10% of our gross domestic product, GDP, by 2100. I like to say, compared to what? Well, for context, that would be more than double the losses incurred during the Great Recession of the last decade. More than double the losses of the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression. However, all these costs are woefully underestimated. How can we truly put a price tag on the toll of this destruction? What is the cost for a fourth generation farm family that loses their land and their livestock? What is the cost of a bridge inundated by water separating a community from a hospital or other emergency services? What is the cost of a family that loses a child to an asthma attack on a high particular matter day? The circumstances I've laid out are dire because that is the crisis we face, and we cannot evade it into oblivion. This poster says it all. No matter where we live, we can't ignore the reality of climate change or its effect. We have to accept and address this crisis, but as Albert Einstein once said, in adversity lies opportunity. and that opportunity before us is even greater. More than 3 million people have gone to work in the clean energy sector in the U.S. in recent years. And those jobs are in renewable energy generation, energy efficiency, smart grid and storage, cleaner fuels, and lower emission vehicles. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes to complete my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Nearly 500,000 of these clean energy jobs are in the solar and wind industries, and 1 out of every 6 construction workers in this country now make their living in emergency and energy efficiency. 1 out of every 5 companies involved in making motor vehicle parts make their money from products that make our cars, our trucks, and our vans cleaner. Our clean energy revolution did not happen by accident. We put smart policies in place, and we had leadership that believed climate change was a threat. During the Obama administration, starting with the Recovery Act, the federal government provided economic incentives and smart regulations to support market investments in clean energy. We must build on this progress, continue to support policies that reduce our nation's carbon footprint, help create a more robust economy, and support those most vulnerable to climate change. But instead of pursuing any ideas to address climate change and protect Americans from its effect, the Trump administration has sadly decided to ignore climate change, decided to defund clean energy research, and roll back any meaningful climate action, decided to walk away from provisions that would help protect Americans from rising floods and other extreme weather events. Our president's failed leadership on climate change threatens our health, our economy, U.S. competitiveness, and our future. And sadly, most of our, not all, but most of our Republican friends have been applauding the president with every action. And in conclusion, let me just say to the American people, don't be fooled or distracted by these political games. We cannot allow cynicism to win. We can reduce our nation's carbon footprint, we can strengthen our economy, and we can support those most vulnerable among us. Indeed, we must. Climate change is real. Human activity is the dominant cause. Congress needs to act. Let's stop the political theater and start to address the climate change before us today while we still have time. And we do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Bridget Beatty of Arizona to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Bridget S. Beatty of Arizona to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown. Yes. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Mrs. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Braun, Carper, Collins, Cotton, Graham, Hyde-Smith, Isaacson, Kennedy, Paul, Rosen, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Murray, Schatz, and Smith. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Ms. McSally, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Ms. Sinema. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Markey. No. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mr. Casey. No. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Wyden. No. Mr. Schumer. No. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mr. Jones. Aye. Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Perdue? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Hawley? Aye. Mr. Moran? Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Gardner? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Young? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Ms. Harris? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Ms. Ernst. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Merkley. No. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Kramer. Aye. Mr. Menendez. No. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Oh. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Lankford, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye.
Does any senator wish to change their vote? Has any senator not voted? On this vote, the yeas are 77, the nays are 20. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The majority leader is recognized.
Senate's not in order.
The Senate will come to order. Conversations will cease. Senate will come to order.
Mr. President,
Majority leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all post-cloture time on the Beatty nomination expire at 2:15 tomorrow. Further, if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the Senate be immediately President be immediately notified of the Senate's action. I further ask that following disposition of the Beatty nomination, the Senate proceed to legislative session and resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 8 with the time until 4 p.m. equally divided between the two leaders or their designees. Finally, notwithstanding the provisions of Rule 22, the cloture motions with respect to the motions to proceed to S.J. Res. 8 and H.R. 268 ripen at 4 p.m. tomorrow.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 863.
The clerk will report.
S-863, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to clarify the grade and pay of podiatrists of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today at adjourn until 10 a.m. Tuesday, March 26th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Beatty nomination under the previous order. Finally, that the Senate recess from 12:30 until 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection.
So if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask to stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of our Democratic colleagues.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it is my great honor and pleasure to be joined on the floor today by my senior senator from Rhode Island, the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Jack Reed. We are here today on the Senate floor to speak about the perils that climate change poses to America's national security. I'm going to frame my remarks around a fact